Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our look at free agency for the team this summer. More from Frank Madden, his cap sheet, individual players, as Frank, Camille, and I all take a look at that. Coming up after this, part 2 of the big free agency episode coming your way next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, about to be joined once again by Camille Davis and Frank Madden. As look, we told you we had received word from Frank that he wanted to get some things off his chest for the offseason here and put together a free agency episode. We started to do that and quickly realized this was a marathon recording. It was going to have to be broken into multiple episodes. So we touched quite a bit on the generalities, where the Bucks are currently at. We touched on the second apron aspect and some other things in part 1. In part 2, coming your way here, we get into a lot more of the individual player takeaways. Before we do get to part 2, let us remind you that today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And speaking of get started, let us do that now as we now get to the conversation on individual players the Bucks could potentially target, whether it be free agency or via a trade, and just how much room there is for young players on this roster. We had that conversation with Ty and a few other times on the show, but we get Frank Madden's thoughts on it coming your way next on Locked On Bucks. All right, Frank, we spent quite a bit of time on yesterday's episode talking about the basically ideas of what the Bucks need to do in this offseason, or what they should be looking at doing, the constraints they're up against, the second apron, all of that, and the dilemma of that first round pick. So we'll assume we've solved most of those issues, and now it gets down to we've hit July 1 and it's free agency. We mentioned you put together a list of guys that are realistic to somewhat realistic for the Bucks. Obviously, it's not Paul George on this list or DeMar DeRozan, but looking through, okay, here's a similar comp of a guy that signed last year for right around what the Bucks have to offer. Here are the guys that are going to be free agents. It's roughly 30 names out there, and then a handful of guys that are currently under contract with other teams as well that you would think, given either their cap figure or situation on their current team, that it probably wouldn't take as much. The Bucks should have enough to potentially pry one of those guys loose. So I'll start with you, since you compiled the names. We'll pick one guy, and we can kind of go back and forth here with the three of us. But the first guy you would pick of this group you put together, that whether it's because you think he's the most attainable or he fits something the Bucks sorely lack, that intrigues you the most.
Well, it's hard to choose, not because there's so many I like, but more because it's just such a grim list to look at. I mean, I will say this, like, I think both in the draft as well as when we're looking at these names, for better or worse, like, it's almost like, best player available is kind of where I start, just because, you look at the Bucks needs. On the one hand, you can say, hey, they've got 4 of their 5 starting spots, like, very much locked down, and they have, obviously, in Bobby Portis, like, as much as, we've been talking about him as though he's, just a chess piece to flip off for in a trade. I mean, he's also a guy that, came up just shy of winning 6th man of the year. And, he obviously, I think, especially late in the season, reminded us, like, what he's able to do, especially in the regular season, his night to night consistency, especially when Giannis is out. And he did have some good games in the playoffs as well, perhaps not the consistency that we want. But so, I mean, you obviously have like the skeleton of a rotation here. But I think, when I think about, like, the needs that you have, I think fifth starter. That's kind of where I start, right? I think they will probably most likely re-sign Pat Beverly. Whether he is the fifth starter or not, that's kind of a separate question. But he's a very weird player in that regard because he's sort of a point guard, but not really a shot creator. And when I think about what they need, I think they need a guy that can play the two and take defensive pressure off of certainly Damian Lillard, potentially if the guy's big enough, maybe help out Chris Middleton as well. Ideally make some shots, but more or less just defend. Doesn't need to be particularly creative. So I think that's sort of my job requirements on the fifth starter. I think you need some wing athleticism. Is that something you address through free agency? Is that something you address just because you say, Andre Jackson, we're actually going to give you a longer leash and let you play more this year? Or potentially you do get some of that through the draft if you keep at least one of these picks that we've been talking about. Maybe that's less needed in terms of what you do in free agency. And then I think, a mobile big, I think is something that, we mentioned as a potential position to target in the draft. And I think for two reasons. I think, on the one hand, the Bucks have been spoiled with Bobby, Brooke, and of course Giannis. But the flip side is, I think the upside of potentially drafting a guy who could slot in there, especially if it's a guy maybe that can kind of cycle between the 4 and the 5, is it's not just Brooke Lopez insurance, it's also Bobby Portis insurance, and gives you some more flexibility to maybe move either of those guys moving forward. So so you can go, I think, a number of different directions on draft night. I think you can go a number of different directions in free agency. In free agency, you're going to have to go multiple directions, obviously, because you got a roster to fill out. But I think at the top, I would just start with, who do you have that you're promoting into positions? Mm-hmm. So we have Malik Beasley, who, again, we're presuming will get more than a minimum or more than a minimum plus 20%, which the Bucks can offer salary elsewhere. So, nice job, Malik. Hopefully he cashes out, worked out for him. Didn't end the way we wanted in the playoffs with Malik, but again, for what he signed for, I think that was a really good signing for the Bucks, right? Yeah. But you have to replace him. I think looking at the roster, obviously Jay Crowder as that kind of backup 3/4. We're assuming he's not back either. So ideally, maybe that's a more athletic wing. But you look at Andre Jackson and AJ Green, and you say, well, AJ Green can potentially be the Malik Beasley. Maybe he doesn't start. Maybe it's a Pat Beverly or Pat Beverly type that actually starts. But AJ Green is maybe that Malik Beasley facsimile that you have. And then Andre Jackson just becomes next year's Jay Crowder, but infinitely less depressing. So, that could be sort of the path forward there. So if you just start with that, I mean, you've already got kind of like most of, basically you have more or less your top 8 mostly filled up. So it's not like you have some massive need. But again, I would start with the 5th starter spot. And even as much as I like AJ Green, huge turnaround, me being the huge AJ Green skeptic 2 years ago, now I'm all in on, Team AJ. But I think if I was looking at some of the options there, again, my first question is, can this guy defend the opposing point guard and also ideally defend, maybe not, Jason Tatum or like big wings, but can he defend, moderately sized wings and kind of hold up in that regard so that Chris doesn't have to do all of that. So I think there's a number of guys out there, like a Chris Dunn, I think is going to get more than the minimum. Yeah. So I had him on the list, but I don't really think he's probably going to be available. Like Derrick Jones Jr., I think, can make more money as an athletic wing, probably re-signing in Dallas, especially what he's done in the playoffs. So I had him on the list, but I don't really think that he's probably going to come back for that little money. So I think, again, probably looking at kind of who's available. Again, I've really liked Dennis Smith Jr. He's a flawed player. His 3-point shot, which looked like such a weapon in college and got him, made him a lottery pick, has really looked broken the past couple of years. But he has become an incredible defensive player, which talk about a weird, character arc for a draft pick. Nobody would have pegged him as becoming this pseudo all defensive caliber guard who can't really score that effectively, but he is extremely athletic as well. So, if we're including trade targets, I might say my guy Dante Exum. Kane and I annually always got to talk about our boy Dante Exum. Hasn't had a lot of run in the playoffs, which I like. I like it, guys. Trade him, Dallas. If you're not going to use him, trade him to us for a second-round pick. But if just talking about free agents, I'll maybe throw out Dennis Smith Jr. Maybe he gets more than the minimum finally after signing for that the last couple of years, more or less. But he would be interesting and also would potentially obfuscate the need for a Pat Beverly type because they're probably maybe a little bit too similar.
The same. Right.
But at least gives you certainly a lot more athleticism, dynamism, and I think legitimately a really good defensive player, not having to rely on maybe some of the smoke and mirrors that a guy like Pat does.
Camille?
So I didn't say it on the other episode, but talking about the bigs in the draft, who might fit, got to show some love to Marquette's on Iguodaro. Like that could be somebody who does fit. Just got to throw my Marquette connection out there. But looking at the list,
Camille, I gotta say, Camille, you were never. Do you just not like Jay Crowder that much? Because I feel like you never showed any real favoritism towards Jay last year, and I always kind of like respected it because he had his like moments, like he had some good run. It's not like it was just like a horrible 2 years in Milwaukee or something like that. But you kept it real. You kept yourself at a distance despite the fact that he's another Marquette guy.
I try to. Like Jay, I said it before, like me and Jay were actually at Marquette at the same time, had a class together. He was super cool, unlike some other guys at Marquette at that time, but that's neither here nor there. I do try to keep it real.
Is his last name the name of a color that's out there?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I just had to keep like the performance we got from Jay. It wasn't what we thought we were going to get with those 5 second-round draft picks. So that is what it is. I was hoping that, year 2 would be better. It just did not work out that way for him. But thinking about free agents for the Bucks, Frank, like you said, the list doesn't inspire much confidence. There's not many names on there where you're like, oh, if we got him, that'd change everything. Like these are all very small moves. And again, it's because of the Bucks cap situation. They just don't have that many options. So when looking through like Chris Dunn, like we mentioned, someone who I was interested in around the trade deadline, would still have some interest there for that combo guard role. But the bigs, Najee Marshall is one that's interesting to me, just kind of a wing, like some athleticism there on the wing there. If we talked about the Pelicans and what they might have to do there. So that's a name that's interesting to me. When I saw Thomas Bryant before we got on the recording, I said to Justin, like, who did he even play for? I don't remember seeing Thomas Bryant playing much last year. And we're like, oh, yeah, it was with Miami, just not that many games with Miami.
By the way, Thomas Bryant is so weird. Like, you look at his numbers, he's like super productive every year. Like you look at any of like the advanced metrics, like they're always like way better than his minutes would suggest he is, which I think speaks to the fact that like, he is not a great defensive player, more of an, like always like a high mid 60% true shooting guy. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, is there like a version of Thomas Bryant that could take the Bobby Portis role and do the similar stuff to what Bobby does here? Like, I could see it.
It could. Like, that's a name that stood up to me like, that could work. That could work. Mo Bamba is a name that has been connected with the Bucks for years.
Finally replacing Brook Lopez, right?
Finally.
Only 4 years after half of Bucks fan base was ready to go all the way for Mo Bamba.
Yeah, they're ready to play that Shaq G loud. Like they were ready to let that Mo Bamba ride out, let him come to town. Like, so these are like, none of the names are like, I really am excited about this. It's just like, these are names here who would fit a role for the team and trade targets. If Davion Mitchell, if Off Night wasn't 6 feet tall and pairing him with another, 6'1" guard in the backcourt, like I would love the idea of that, but just the idea of having 2 6-foot guards in your backcourt, I don't love that as much, but golly, Off Night, the defense, definitely have been a fan of his. Kendrick Williams, again, there are names here, Frank, where it's like I could see it around the edges here, especially if you're trading out some of the older veterans that we've gotten used to, and then you're hoping that some of the young guys who we've talked about do take that role and they step up into it. But I mean, listen, there's not much that'll get me excited. Outside of maybe like a Tari Eason, like if there was somehow some way that shook out. I mean, we mentioned Herb Jones, it's on the list. It's not super realistic for an Herb Jones, but if you could figure out a way to do that. But yeah, it's a lot of different guys where when you hear the names, I think as fans, you're going to be like, that's it. That's all we can do. But as mentioned, the Bucks have their 4 starters. Like a lot of the rotation is set, so you're just trying to plug in around them. Yeah. So like,
well, I like how Camille, like we started. Justin's prompt was to basically like pick a free agent, and Camille's out here talking about Herb Jones.
Well,
like, come on, Camille, you're cheating over here. You're picking over my trade list over here. Like, I didn't know Tari Eason was an option for this question. Come on.
I mean, Frank, I can't help but notice you to put LeBron James on there because the Bucks could draft Bronny with the 23.
Right. Keep that 23.
Need a point guard. Need a point guard.
Exactly. Bronny starting at the 2, and you know, I will finally accept Chris Middleton coming off the bench for LeBron James to start.
And only LeBron James.
Okay, it's okay. I'll let Chris come off the bench. I've made peace with it.
A couple other names I do want to get to here. And look, we mentioned the word flawed, that these are all flawed players. I mean, yeah, because that's, as we mentioned, that's what the Bucks have to deal with. You're not throwing out big dollar amounts. You have to be scraping the bottom of the barrel for some of these guys and find the flawed player that is the least flawed or has some aspects to his game that fits what you're looking for. So we'll continue the conversation after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, this episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel, where it is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right. I know I said one name. We've all thrown out multiple names.
I said at least 7.
Yeah. and one, at least one that isn't even on the list too.
Just one. Everyone else was on the list.
I'm going to repeat names that were already mentioned. I have long been a Chris Dunn stan. I would assume he gets more than what the Bucks have to offer, which very well may be the minimum, but he would be perfect for the team. Some other names, Josh Okogie. I know it's a player option. Phoenix is an interesting team to keep an eye on for the obvious reasons. Obviously, those rumblings of, hey, they're interested in LeBron and Bronny. So who knows, but he would fit part of what we talked about, being that defensive guy that can play next to Damian Lillard. I think one of the other names that Camille mentioned, and I think, Camille, you and I were talking about it before we started recording, but Najee Marshall, I've always liked parts of his game too. And again, it goes back to what we talked about for most of last year, that I think your approach is also, well, we have Dame and Chris and Giannis, so we have scoring there. And that was the biggest thing that surprised us about Malik starting, but you're getting scoring from there. So everybody playing around those guys, you can't be a zero offensively, but you're there for your defense. And I think that's a role that Najee Marshall could help fill. That's a name that has intrigued me. Daniel Tice is an interesting name, and I think he could fill a lot of the Bobby Portis components in terms of bigs off the bench for you. And, you look at some of the other names. Look, I think the big one, when we talk about defense and the ability to hit shots, that would jump out the most of this list would be Justin Holiday. But then it also goes back to we're not doing anything about the age issue there, because I believe he's 35 or 36. So that's what it's come to, though, for where the Bucks are outside of a trade or outside of shedding some of that money. Those are the types of names that you're going to have to be looking at. The one other name, and I think Camille, I think it was one of the 30-some names that you listed before. But, when we talk about filling roles, Ayo Dosunmu, that's the guy that when you think
trade
about
target. Trade target. Let's be clear.
Trade target, not free agent.
Not
trade target. Ayo Dosunmu is the guy of ideally everything you would hope to get from Pat Connaughton, most of it right here from this guy.
Yeah, and maybe just I'll link this on Twitter as well, just the list if people want to look at it and kind of pick out their favorites. But just real quick, just we've hit on a lot of these, but like kind of among the guards, Dennis Smith, Chris Dunn, Shake Milton, DeLon Wright, Talon Horton Tucker. By the way, he's somehow only like 23 years old still.
Yeah.
It feels like he should be 28 or 29, but
At least.
he's still only.
Well, Talon Horton Tucker and Giannis on the same team. I mean, that is unstoppable.
Jay Williams would anoint the Bucks immediate championship favorites. Monty Morris, kind of a disappointing anonymous playoffs for him. He was a guy I thought was pretty interesting. You mentioned Josh Okogie, who's actually pretty interesting, I think, as a role-playing kind of potential fifth starter type guy for the Bucks. Aaron Holiday, if we want to make it up to the Holiday family, Justin or the younger point guard Aaron Holiday. Delano Banton probably, I think, is going to have his team option picked up in Portland. Yeah. He's a weirdo, really big defensive guard, but got some run, put up some numbers late in the year. Spencer Dinwiddie, he's had a very weird arc these last few years.
I am not interested in Dinwiddie. Nobody.
Well, Lonnie Walker had a big year last year after signing for the minimum with Brooklyn. Yeah. Again, I feel like he's probably going to get more than the minimum after that. He's not like a great defensive player. Like I feel like he's probably been, people assume he's better defensively than he is, but I mean, he's better than Malik Beasley, let's say, and he's bigger. And I think he's, has a bit more athleticism as well. So, I mean, could you sell him on, hey, come here, we'll give you a minimum and you'll be a starter, on a team that has big ambitions? Like, I don't know, maybe. As I said, Derrick Jones Jr. probably going to stay in Dallas, just given how well he's played. KJ Martin is a guy I really liked when he was in Houston. And then he really kind of just had a pretty forgettable year between the Clippers and Sixers. So again, weird kind of super athletic wing / undersized four. Alec Burks. I feel like I've been talking about Alec Burks as like a potential bench scorer for years and years. Gary Harris, free agent, again, defensive combo, maybe always hurt. Kelly Oubre, I would guess probably gets more than the minimum given he had a really solid year in Philly. Troy Brown, man, he showed some stuff 2 years ago. Last year was very forgettable. Evan Fournier, team option. Don't think that's going to be picked up. So he's going to be floating around. Kyle Anderson, obviously a very weird player. Not going to give you any athleticism, but super smart. You mentioned Justin Holiday. Reggie Bullock, probably done. Cam Reddish, a guy that I think everybody always, a lot of people obviously find interesting just given his kind of draft pedigree, the athleticism, the size is obviously there. Had, I'd say, some good run at times last year in LA, but certainly has not broken through the way a lot of people hoped. Lamar Stevens, whatever. Najee Marshall. Trendon Watford, by the way, like I actually watched Trendon Watford YouTube clips last night because I remember him having a really good game against the Bucks. He's like 6'8", but he mostly plays power forward, and he just sort of like drives to the basket constantly and is like a super productive offensive player, but I don't know that, what he really is. But and then I think the bigs are probably like the least interesting, which also gives me pause to move on from Bobby and Brooke to some extent. But you mentioned Daniel Tice, Mason Plumlee, Thomas Bryant, Mo Bamba, and Xavier Tillman, who's I think a pretty solid player and still playing.
I mean, he's one that he checks a lot of the box. He's not a rim protector, but you could play him next to Giannis and you can switch with him. That he has some interesting aspects to his game, and you kind of mentioned it before too, but he's not really playing with the Celtics.
So hit us up on Twitter. Let us know who you guys like. Hit us in the comments on YouTube. But again, you don't need to sign 5 guys here. Depending on trades, draft picks, etc. Maybe there's only again maybe 2-3 guys you end up signing as free agents, and again that's not including Pat Beverly, who probably is the most likely of kind of the free agent types to potentially sign back. But maybe just maybe as a kind of additional question for you guys, we've been hitting on some of these potential trade targets. I came up with this list. My criteria for these trade target guys was you couldn't be too good. So the thought was like, who could you potentially get in a Bobby/Pat plus draft picks type of move? And basically all these guys are making less than or the same as Bobby and or Pat. So the list that I came up with was Ochai Agbaji, the wing who's traveled a fair bit, former Kansas guy who's with Toronto right now, shooting guard, right? Quentin Grimes, who I actually have taken a shine to, kind of forgettable year last year, ended up in Detroit, but 2 years ago had a really nice season with the Knicks, and I feel like he's a pretty seamless fit with the Bucks kind of starting five. So again, with all the young guys that Detroit has, like, is he somebody that you could get for, I don't know, maybe they like Marjon Beauchamp, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
Cody Martin, a lot of injuries the last couple of years. This is Charlotte Martin twin, not Caleb in Miami. He's got an $8 million contract. He's not cheap, and he's been hurt a ton. Hasn't shot well.
I don't think you need to remind Bucks fans which one is Caleb. I think we remember.
Well, maybe we were blocking it out. Nick Richards, $5 million a year, big man for the Hornets as well. Again, flawed player, but interesting. Does a little bit on offense, a little bit on defense. Could he be your third big or a potential insurance policy? Maybe. And Trey Mann, I'll put Trey Mann and Terrence Mann. Trey Mann of the Hornets, $5 million a year, smaller kind of guard creator. Terrence Mann, the larger guard / creator / two-way guy in LA. Both potentially interesting options for a team like the Bucks. You mentioned Ayo Dosunmu. I already mentioned Dante Exum. I don't know. But Dante Exum's going to like land in Milwaukee when he's like 32 years old and on his last legs and like on like a non-guaranteed deal, and he won't make the team coming out of camp. That's how like what his fate I feel like is. But if you get him next year, that would be, I think, potentially interesting. Just his fit, I think, is really nice with what the Bucks have. And then Jayshawn Tate and Tari Eason, kind of like the weirdo forward physical guys in Houston. Zaire Williams in Memphis. Again, is he a great player? No, still young, has some pedigree. Maybe a dice roll type guy. Kenrich Williams, we mentioned. Aaron Wiggins, interesting, very cheap young wing for the Thunder. I feel like I'm always like, I don't expect to get any great deals out of Sam Presti, but you never know. And then Wendell Carter. I think if you were talking about potential trade target bigs, his role in Orlando is a little bit interesting now because he started for a while and then lost his starting job due to injury, and then Jonathan Isaac, I think, has reclaimed some of his lost luster with his defensive styling. So who knows? Maybe Wendell Carter could be available for the right price as well. And then you mentioned Davion Mitchell. So yeah, again, all guys, they're all making $12 million between, like, Aaron Wiggins makes $2 million. Most of these guys make between $3 and $8 million, and then Terrence Mann makes 11. Wendell Carter makes 12. So all these guys like could be in one of these hypothetical trades for either Pat or Bobby. And again, assuming that you probably have to attach a pick to Pat, but I don't know. There's at least maybe some potential there if the Bucks wanted to make a move with Pat and use that first round pick and potentially add a younger, potentially more productive player. Maybe there's something there.
We will take one more break here and then start to wrap up. Put some final thoughts on these names that we mentioned, the direction the Bucks are headed, and everything else after this on Locked On Bucks. This segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by BetterHelp. And look, as we go through this free agency episode, you've noticed a few of us may stand for one player, maybe not so much on somebody else, but it's always important to get some of those things off your chest, and more importantly, things that are much larger than the free agency acquisitions of your favorite team. That's where BetterHelp comes in for the assist. As we all carry around these different stressors, big or small, when we keep them bottled up, it starts to affect all of us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever is weighing you down. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and most importantly, suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and from there, you get matched with a licensed therapist. You can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month today. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Camille, before you get back in here, not to freeze you out, just a couple of things. To me, look, of all the names on the list, I think we've touched on who stands out to us the most for whatever reasons. But the big thing for me is if you were to target specific teams, and they're the ones that I would circle are pretty well represented here. The Thunder, look, it may not be great trading with Sam Presti, but the Thunder are a team that you feel like, I know Sam Presti kind of hinted at the opposite, but you feel like, okay, they kind of have to do something this summer where you start to get a logjam of guys that are playing the same position. And those names that we mentioned, they're basically blocked by the best players on the Thunder team. And they're reaching the point where you kind of have to make one of those 2-for-1s or 3-for-1 type of trade. That's a team that I think is interesting and worth monitoring, if not for the Bucks, for everyone else. I think the Memphis Grizzlies are in the same boat there. When you think about the young guys that they saw come on last year, and now you consider, okay, John Morant is coming back, and Marcus Smart, and basically everybody else on their roster. So they're probably going to be in the same spot of, all right, let's try to maximize this and turn a handful of younger guys into something else. And then I think the last team is just the Charlotte Hornets. They're pretty well represented on your list, Frank. But if for no other reason than what we've seen from a handful of guys, especially in this playoffs, that have left Charlotte and gone on to be big contributors for other teams, I think it's easy to kind of comb over their roster and say, what about this guy? I wonder if this guy, if you get him out of Charlotte, if he could kind of find his footing.
That would be nice. That would be nice, especially if that was found in Milwaukee, found money. I mean, I said it earlier, but another name I think that should be mentioned amongst trade targets still is that Grant Williams name, just because there was that interest there. He is that smaller, mobile, defensive big. The shot wasn't super consistent in Dallas, but he did start playing a little bit better when he got to Charlotte, if I remember correctly, this past season. Not a big sample size there, but another name, although I know Bobby Portis would be disgusted to hear his name wrapped up in that one again. But I do think those teams in particular that you mentioned, Justin, are teams to keep an eye on. We talked about the Pelicans as well earlier as a team to keep a name on. We talked about Najee Marshall as well, the weird forward, but just given the depth chart for the Pelicans, that's another guy where it's like he could just find himself just out of the rotation and on the move in a deal somehow, some way, that way. And we know that the big guy that they're trying to get out of there is Brandon Ingram. That's not a likely fit. I don't think that's realistic here in Milwaukee, but that Najee Marshall name I think is one to really keep an eye on. Terrence Mann was a trade target idea. If that goes that way, if the Bucks could somehow find out a way to get Terrence Mann, that's something I'd be very interested in. I guess of the trade targets, that's probably the name that's like the most enticing to me is Terrence Mann. And then looking at free agents, as mentioned, a lot of names that we've already said. Chris Dunn is probably the name that sticks out to me the most. I don't think we'd be able to afford Kelly Oubre, but if somehow things shake out the way they did last year, where you're seeing some guys still hanging around where you're like, I did not expect this to go this way. Would love to find him here in Milwaukee, but it's going to be an interesting offseason because it really does depend on what the Bucks want to do in regards to those core guys who helped them win a championship with Brook Lopez, with Bobby Portis, with Pat Connaughton. And the decisions around them is really going to impact the rest of the roster as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out, but the Bucks have to do a little something. They don't have a lot of room to do a lot. So it's only going to be a little bit. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that might shake out for them.
One other team I'll throw out there too is the Pistons, for the obvious reason of they got somebody in charge now, a new man in charge who didn't build this roster. So who are the guys that maybe he doesn't align with or think this is the way that I want to play? So that's interesting team. And I think the most interesting name is one that Frank mentioned too, with Quentin Grimes. Look, there's been the reports that they're interested in adding some size, and I think with where the franchise is at too, they're interested in adding some fans. And the Bucks have a big guy that gets the crowd going, which could make that an interesting trade partner. But those are like the types of teams that I think are interesting and probably most worth monitoring for the Bucks when we think about trade partners. The last thing I have for you, Frank, I don't know how to really word this without sounding pretty offensive to both guys, but between the two names that we've mentioned the most of Pat and Bobby, boy, rehab. Which of the two players do you think has the most clear path to, yeah, you could rehabilitate this guy and get him back to the level that he was? I think that's probably a bit unfair for Bobby that he's been consistent. It's probably most slapped on Pat Connaughton with some of the struggles we've seen in the past. But of the two guys, when they're at their best, which is more important for the way that the Bucks roster is situated?
Well, I mean, I think I'm thinking back, like, a couple of years ago, going back to the finals, right? I mean, Pat was the guy that you thought of as like potentially closing games, in the highest leverage situations. So in terms of like which guy has peaked in terms of, team value, like I would say Pat probably was the most valuable guy in that regard. Which again, I have to acknowledge, Bobby Portis hit 2 huge shots in the fourth quarter of closeout game 6 that I was in the building for. I have not forgotten that. So Bobby's also obviously had his moments, and he's been certainly the more impactful regular season player consistently night in and night out. I think pretty unequivocally Bobby would have the higher value as a trade piece right now. I think Pat would have probably a slight like negative value just because he likely has 2 years left. They're both going to be extension eligible, but there's a very big difference between the two guys, because I think Pat you'd look at and say, well, he's going to pick up his option year after next for $9.4 million, whereas Bobby very well could opt out of, I think, what it'd be like $13 million, something like that, in a couple of years that he'll be owed. So with both of them being extension eligible, I don't think you need to do anything with Pat, right? Like Pat's effectively got 2 years left on his contract. Bobby, I think, is the more interesting guy, because if you don't sign him to an extension, then he effectively becomes an expiring contract in all likelihood. Again, like, is Bobby Portis going to go into free agency and get, another 4-year, $50 million contract? I'm a little skeptical of that, right? I think I don't know if that would happen. But I think there's certainly a greater likelihood that he would opt out than Pat. So it is an interesting question. Like, if the Bucks don't want to sign Bobby to an extension and just kind of want to let it ride, then I think, you kind of have to explore what kind of trade options would be out there. And again, as you mentioned earlier, like, it does not seem like the Bucks would need to start looking for potential Bobby Portis trades. I think it would just be a matter of, reheating those discussions that probably had been ongoing for a while. So, if those guys are still on the Bucks roster as of October, I don't think it's going to be because the Bucks said put a big do not call us sign above them, and had to fight people off with a stick. I think it's going to be because they probably asked around, and whoever they were trying to get. And I think, to be clear, guys, like when we talk about like shopping players, I mean, Jon Horst isn't calling up the Pistons or whoever and saying like, oh, you want Bobby Portis, right? I mean, you're calling up teams because you have targeted players,
Right.
And then when they ask, well, what are you going to give me for Quentin Grimes? You have to say, well, I really don't want to trade Pat Connaughton. He's so essential to everything we do. But we would consider trading Pat Connaughton for Quentin Grimes, right? That would be more of how the conversation would go, rather than slapping the for sale sign on Pat. Although, as a real estate investor, he probably, would have to appreciate the real estate signage. So to make a short answer long, as I always do, Justin, I would say, Pat is probably the guy that, is more of the kind of dead salary type of guy.
Mhm.
But that said, I think people kind of went overboard, proclaiming the death of Pat Connaughton this year. And he actually was, had a couple of really great months.
Really good stretches. Yeah. Like January to March. Yeah.
And, and he does stuff like, I just worry, like, I think my biggest concern last year was just the fact that he took fewer threes, he rebounded less.
Yeah.
He doesn't dunk as much as he used to. I think that does kind of indicate that he's physically had some decline, which again, for a guy like him, he was relying on his athleticism for a while. And now he doesn't have quite as much to fall back on. So that's obviously a limiting factor for him. And, again, it's not like he's like 34, but, you get to around 30, you kind of start to slow down a little bit.
How much of a factor too, the fewer threes was, oh, by the way, you have Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley on the team now. Whereas the year prior, I mean, there was a lot of injuries, but Pat for half the season was number 1 or 2 on the team in 3-point attempts.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and last year too, it's like, I mean, way too much of the year involved Pat Connaughton having to like dribble the ball up the floor and, run dribble handoffs. And he's not going to shoot threes off the bounce, right? He's going to shoot threes because he's parked in the corner and, getting swing passes. Ironically, it's almost like if you put the ball in his hands more, he's going to shoot less, right? Because of just the nature of the type of player he is. So, again, is what it is. But certainly going to be a strong test of the Bucks, kind of loyalty / willingness to kind of continually run it back. If again, we see this core group from the championship team back for yet another run together. Of course, my nostalgic side would like it to, just because I like those guys. But if we're being pragmatic, obviously, I mean, you got to explore options, because certainly we can, you can kind of, I think there's this losing in the first round with the injuries, I think can very easily allow you to fall into the trap of saying like, oh,
just run it back.
We would have beaten the Pacers, and then we could have given the Celtics a run for their money, and we could have been in the finals, right? Look at Dallas. Their profile is basically the Bucks regular season profile. And now they're in the finals, right? But you have to be careful, because I think on the one hand, I think you've got the makings of a team that can do those things. But you can't just, again, use those excuses to say, well, we can just run it back and, change some stuff really on the fringes of the roster. I think got to obviously take a long, hard look in the mirror and see how they can get better.
One thing I would add to that before we wrap up, in addition to if they're on the team, that's probably why, but it also could just be the Bucks didn't have any offers that they felt were like, this is actually going to make us better, or we're getting something back in value. Like, it could be a situation.
A trade to make a trade.
Yep. Right. It could be one of those situations with those guys too, where the trade doesn't come in the off season. It might come during the regular season before the next trade deadline. Maybe the guys are able to play themselves into better value, whatever the case may be. But I would say, like, if there are Bucks fans who are waiting for the Bucks to make a trade, and if it doesn't happen this offseason, that does not mean that it won't happen during the season at some point. It just means that maybe the conversations didn't have a return value that the Bucks actually looked at and said, that will make us better. And they said, staying put right now actually is our best course of action, given the other options that we had.
I'd say watch draft night. I think draft night is going to be a really interesting litmus test for what this team wants to do and what they're thinking and what their optionality is
for a lot of
those
teams
guys
too.
Yeah. So I think if those guys, make it past draft night, then I think certainly the probability of them sticking around through into the regular season becomes much, much higher. Because again, I just think if the Bucks are going to make any type of trade, then that's the salary that you can move. And, the picks were the kind of most obvious assets, because all the other picks are so far out in the future practically that, like, the risk profile associated with it, it's very different types of teams would want picks in, 2031 versus picks in June, right? We can say the draft sucks, blah, 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 but those are at least real basketball players, and they're not, freaking.
Well, and because that general manager may not be making the pick in 2031 too. So, and look, the other interesting part is if we do see somebody moved, any of the names that we mentioned in basically, I don't want to say like a money saving move, but one that would shed some of that, what that means for the free agency period. If it's, hey, we we think we're going to be able to get this player, but we need one of the exceptions for it. So we're going to shave off X amount of dollars that we open that up. That could be an interesting tell as well. But draft night is going to be the first night where we start to get a glimpse of that. And we are going to be 3 weeks away from the draft. So it is a matter of weeks before we start to answer some of these questions. We'll try to do something similar after the draft. And once we have a better idea of the Bucks cap situation for this offseason and reacting to the moves that were made at the draft and what that could mean for free agency. But that will bring this marathon to a close. Our first run through of everything the Bucks are facing, some of the very flawed names that we just spent the last 2 episodes really going over as well. So a lot of fun knocking this one out. And as I mentioned, we'll have a closer look at free agency itself once we have a better idea of what that's going to look for and to get closer to that. So for Camille and for Frank, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.